The cold truth of Eli Parker's childhood was not carved out in shouts or slammed doors, but in silence that gnawed at him until he believed he was worth nothing. He was 13, trapped in a household that had long since decayed. His father, lost to gambling debts and the lure of neon-lit poker tables, stumbled home smelling of whiskey more often than food. His mother, drowning in the heavy fog of depression, found no comfort in her son's presence. Instead, she scolded him for every small movement, every look that seemed too soft, too unlike a real man. When Eli whispered, almost by accident, that he liked boys, there was no embrace, no moment of gentle understanding. Only the air grew colder. His father sneered. His mother turned her eyes away, as though erasing him would erase the truth. From that day, the distance became unbearable. Meals were eaten in silence. The door to his room stayed closed, not because he wished for privacy, but because shame pressed it shut. Then came a Tuesday morning that would break the fragile illusion of family forever. Eli woke to the sound of nothing. No kettle hissing, no muttered arguments through thin walls. The apartment was stripped of life, cupboards hung open, empty of the little food they had. Drawers yawned with hollow space. On the chipped wooden counter lay a folded note, short and cruel in its simplicity. "We can't do this anymore. Uncle Victor will take care of you." The words cut sharper than any scream. They had not fought him, had not begged him to change. They had simply walked away, leaving a boy to wake up abandoned, as though he were luggage someone decided not to claim. He clutched the paper until his knuckles whitened, his chest collapsing into sobs that no one stayed to hear. That same day, Child Protective Services arrived. They spoke kindly, but their voices were distant, like echoes in a tunnel. They told him his guardian would be Victor Hughes, his uncle. The name was one Eli barely knew, except from whispered family gossip. A man labeled cold, strange, too busy for family, someone who had never married, who lived in a world of business towers and black-tinted cars. Eli felt no comfort in those reassurances. To him, Victor was not a savior, but a stranger, an unknown shadow suddenly stitched into his life. As the car pulled away from the apartment building, Eli looked back once more. The window blinds of his old room were shut tight, sealing off any trace that a child had once lived there. He pressed his forehead to the glass, knowing deep inside that the boy who entered the world through those doors would never return. What no one could see in that moment, least of all Eli himself, was that this fragile, forsaken child, left to carry the unbearable weight of rejection, would one day inherit an empire. And when the very parents who cast him out came crawling back, it would be Eli who forced them to face the bitterness of their own choices. But for now, he was only 13, trembling in the backseat of a government car, with a note in his pocket that said more about love than his parents ever had. Life has a cruel way of teaching us early what it means to be disposable, but it also plants seeds in those broken moments. The lesson waiting for Eli, though hidden, was that being abandoned does not erase worth. It becomes the soil in which resilience grows. If you believe that true family is not measured by blood, but by who stays when the world turns its back, then join us, subscribe to Heart's Story, and walk with us through stories where pain meets strength, and where forgotten children rise to claim the lives they were always meant to live. Victor Hughes arrived not with warmth, but with the sharp precision of a man who built walls to survive. He did not lean down to embrace the boy or soften his voice. Instead, he stood in the doorway of the agency office, tall, immaculately dressed in a dark tailored suit, his presence filling the room with authority that silenced even the caseworker. His words to Eli were brief, stripped of comfort. "Bring one suitcase, that's all." There was no space for questions, no soft reassurance, just the command. And the boy obeyed. Hours later, Eli sat stiffly in the leather backseat of Victor's car, staring at the tinted windows that swallowed the world outside. The silence was suffocating, yet Victor seemed perfectly at ease. His eyes fixed on the road ahead, one hand on the steering wheel, the other resting on the polished gear shift. To Eli, it felt less like being rescued and more like being drafted into a life he had not chosen. The mansion loomed at the edge of the city, a sprawling estate with high stone walls and gates that closed with a mechanical groan behind them. Eli stepped inside and immediately felt like an intruder. Chandeliers glowed above marble floors. Hallways stretched into silence, and portraits of stern-faced ancestors stared down from gilded frames. It was the opposite of the crumbling apartment he had left that morning, yet Eli felt no sense of belonging. He carried his small suitcase into a guest room so large it swallowed him whole. Victor wasted no time setting rules. Each morning would begin at dawn. There would be strict schedules for schoolwork, reading, and piano practice. Meals were to be taken at the table, not in front of a screen. Chores were shared. Eli was expected to keep his room, his clothes, and his responsibilities in perfect order. There was no negotiation. The house ran on Victor's time, not Eli's. Eli resisted in the only ways he could think of. He slammed doors, skipped scales on the piano, left books untouched, hoping to provoke the same abandonment he had already endured. If love was conditional, perhaps this too would vanish. But Victor did not vanish. When Eli broke the rules, punishment came: long hours at the piano bench, essays rewritten from scratch, privileges revoked. Yet never once did Victor raise his hand, and never once did he speak of sending Eli away. It was in those punishments that Eli began to sense something different. On nights when frustration broke him into tears, he would find Victor not storming off but sitting quietly in the same room, working on paperwork while Eli wept beside him. The man's silence was not cruel, it was steady, unyielding, a presence that refused to disappear no matter how Eli fractured. For the first time, Eli discovered what it meant for an adult to remain when he himself had nothing left to hold on to. The days turned into weeks, the weeks into months. Eli slowly understood that this discipline was not about perfection, but about survival. Victor had lived long enough in a world that punished weakness, and he was determined to forge in Eli a spine that would not bend. The piano, which Eli hated, was less about music than about patience, structure, and endurance. The rules were not cages, but rails meant to guide him through a life that would test him at every turn. Eli did not yet see it as love. He saw it as hardness, as stone laid upon his shoulders. But beneath that weight, something in him shifted. He began to believe, tentatively, that he would not be discarded again so easily. Children who grow up with abandonment often learn to mistrust permanence. Yet in Victor's severe consistency, Eli found the first fragile proof that commitment can exist without tenderness and loyalty can take the shape of discipline. It was not the affection he craved, but it was the foundation he desperately needed. And from that foundation, a new self would one day rise. The years that followed were not gentle. Victor Hughes pushed Eli Parker into spaces that felt far beyond his reach. At 14, Eli was enrolled in an elite private school, a place where polished uniforms and the weight of family names filled the air heavier than textbooks. From the first week, he faltered. His assignments came back slashed with red ink, his test scores landed near the bottom, and the whispers of wealthier classmates carried sharp edges. More than once he thought of quitting, retreating into failure as if it were a safe corner. But Victor's voice, cool and unyielding, cut through the haze of self-doubt. "I don't invest in losses," he told him one evening after a failed exam, the words landing with the sting of truth. Eli felt anger surge, but that anger became fuel. Determined not to be written off, he began rising earlier, working later, repeating lessons until the numbers and words stopped swimming on the page. Slowly, he climbed. He discovered the discipline drilled into him at home was now armor against the temptations of surrender. Through this climb, another battle raged beneath the surface, his own identity. By 16, Eli could not deny who he was. His attraction to boys was no longer a secret he could blur with silence. At school, he carried it quietly, fearing ridicule. But one morning, standing before the mirror, he pinned a small rainbow badge to his shirt. It was not loud, not flamboyant, but it was his truth, however fragile. Victor noticed. He said nothing at first, only observed. Later, in the study, he spoke in his measured tone. Do not hide it. People will try to break you for it, but your task is to ensure they never succeed. The words were not tender, yet they carried the weight of a shield. In that moment, Eli understood Victor saw him fully and did not turn away. That single acknowledgement gave Eli a new kind of strength. He no longer saw himself as a boy surviving rejection, but as a young man capable of shaping his future. In debate club, he learned to command a room. In student councils, he discovered leadership. By the time he finished school, his name appeared at the top of honor rolls, a testament not just to intelligence, but to the grit carved into him. When college acceptance letters arrived, Northwestern stood out, a university that promised both challenge and opportunity. Eli stepped onto campus with more than knowledge. He carried the scars of rejection and the steel Victor had forged in him. He chose marketing, drawn to the power of words, images, and strategies that could sway entire crowds. It was a field that mirrored his own life, knowing how to stand tall in a room and hold attention even when doubted. In lecture halls, he no longer shrank. He raised his hand, asked questions, and debated professors. In internships, he absorbed not only the technical craft but the subtle rules of presence, when to speak, when to listen, when to lean into silence. He began to understand that influence was less about force and more about reading the room with clarity. From the frightened boy clutching a note of abandonment, Eli was becoming a man who no longer feared being unseen. He wore his rainbow pin openly now, not as rebellion but as declaration. The rejection of his parents no longer defined him. The discipline of his uncle had taught him to build definition for himself. Education, Eli realized, was not only about grades or universities. It was the steady layering of resilience, the shaping of character in the face of doubt. He carried that lesson as deeply as any textbook, knowing it would serve him long after diplomas gathered dust. By the time Eli Parker turned 27, he had built a life that stretched far beyond the shadows of his childhood. His career in marketing was steadily rising. His voice carried weight in boardrooms, and the quiet confidence instilled in him by Victor Hughes had become second nature. Yet beneath the rhythm of his days, an unspoken truth waited, one that Victor could no longer hide. It began in the smallest ways, a fatigue that lingered after long meetings, a pallor to his uncle's skin that no late nights at the office could explain. When the truth surfaced, it did not come as an apology, but as a fact delivered with the same stark clarity Victor had always wielded. He had leukemia. There was no dramatics, no tears shed in confession. "We all die," he told Eli plainly. "The only thing that matters is what you do before it happens." Eli felt the words like a stone dropped into deep water, the ripples spreading silently through his chest. For months he watched as Victor carried the illness with the same precision he carried his life. Treatments came and went. Pain was endured without complaint. Business continued. Schedules were kept, decisions made. But time was no longer something to stretch, only something to measure carefully. 8 months later, Victor was gone. The house felt cavernous, stripped of its commanding presence. In his final days, Victor had not softened into sentimentality, but he left Eli with words that pierced deeper than any embrace. "You are the son I never let myself have." It was the only confession of love Victor ever voiced, and it lingered in Eli's memory like a permanent imprint. Grief hung heavy, But there was no pause for mourning. The lawyer summoned Eli to the reading of the will, a gathering that would test not only his inheritance, but his strength. The polished conference room was filled with hushed anticipation, the air thick with formality. And then, to his disbelief, Eli saw the faces of the very people who had abandoned him at 13. His parents walked in, dressed well, their eyes gleaming with expectation. They smiled with the confidence of those who believed their share of wealth was already secured. The lawyer unfolded the document, his voice steady as he read. Victor Hughes had left the entirety of his fortune, 70% of a corporation worth tens of millions, along with estates and holdings, to Eli Parker. Shock flickered across the room, but none more vivid than on the faces of his parents, their smiles collapsing into pale disbelief. Then came the twist that sealed their fate. Victor had not been merely a guardian. Years earlier, when Eli was 16, Victor had gone through the legal steps to adopt him fully. It meant Eli was not a ward under temporary care. He was the lawful son of Victor Hughes. The ties of blood with his birth parents had no standing in court, no claim to inheritance, no authority to demand. The revelation struck harder than any rejection Eli had endured. His parents had abandoned him without hesitation, believing they could return years later to collect what they had forfeited. Now they were stripped of even the illusion of entitlement. They sat frozen, the reality of their decision echoing in the silence of the room. Eli listened, his hands still, his face calm. He realized that Victor's final act had not been about wealth alone. It was about cementing a truth Eli had struggled to believe, that he was wanted, chosen, and secured in a way no abandonment could undo. The lesson, sharp and undeniable, was that legacy is not only built on assets or companies. It is written in choices: who we claim, who we stand beside, and who we protect when no one else will. In taking him as a son, Victor had written Eli into a story of belonging, one that blood alone had failed to give. The silence after the lawyer's words stretched like a wound no one wanted to touch. Then, almost on cue, Eli Parker's parents shifted from shock to performance. His mother's eyes filled with tears that seemed rehearsed, her voice trembling as she reached toward him. His father followed with a low sigh, shaking his head as if weighed down by regret. They spoke of mistakes, of lost years, of wanting only to be part of his life again. But their eyes betrayed them. Beneath the quiver of their lips was calculation, a hunger that glinted like a blade in the light. It did not take long for the pretense to fall away. Their words shifted from sorrow to suggestion, hinting that they could help him manage the vast estate, that they could offer wisdom and guidance. It was as though the boy they once discarded had vanished, replaced by a wallet they believed they could reopen. Eli did not flinch. He listened, patient as their desperation grew. Then he spoke, his voice steady, calm enough to cut through the performance. "You left me because I was gay. You decided your shame was greater than your duty. One man you called cold and heartless showed me what family means, and it wasn't either of you." The words settled like a final verdict, but his parents were not done. They raised their voices, demanded reconsideration, even threatened to contest the will. That was when the lawyer cleared his throat and opened a final page. It was Victor's safeguard, the clause he had called his nuclear condition. Should any party attempt to sue or challenge Eli's inheritance, the entirety of the fortune would bypass him as well, transferred directly into a trust for pediatric cancer charities. The implication was absolute. Eli could walk away empty-handed rather than allow greed to poison what Victor had left. His parents' last thread of hope snapped instantly. They rose from their chairs in fury, their shouts echoing down the marble corridors as security was summoned. The same people who once locked a door behind him at 13 were now escorted out of another, clawing at a life they had willingly abandoned. Eli remained seated, his hands resting on the polished table, the lawyer's words still reverberating in the air. He was not triumphant, not vengeful. What he felt was closure. The circle had closed. The boy once left trembling in an empty apartment was gone. In his place stood a man who no longer needed their approval, a man whose worth had been validated not by inheritance, but by the steady, unyielding love of someone who had chosen him when it mattered most. He walked out of that room into the sunlight with his head high, carrying both grief and gratitude. The estate, the company, the wealth, all of it mattered less than the truth. Victor had carved into him that family is not defined by shared blood, but by the ones who stay, who refuse to walk away even when it is inconvenient, even when it is hard. For those who have ever felt abandoned, Eli's story offers more than comfort, it offers proof. Proof that rejection does not define destiny, and that the people who choose us freely can leave marks deeper than those tied by birth. And now, a question for you. If you had to choose, would you trust blood that abandoned you or loyalty that carried you? If stories like Eli's speak to you, if you believe in resilience born from rejection, then this is your place. Subscribe to Heart Stories, share these stories, and stand with us as we uncover more truths about family, strength, and the unexpected ways love can endure.